Welcome, dear listener, to Olympus Dreams. Tonight, we invite you to close your eyes and rest as we carry you gently back to a time before memory, before morning, before the first light ever touched the world. I have always carried the memory of that place the way amber carries its buried warmth. The Eastern Palace. The house of my father and my mother, there at the edge of everything, where the great river Oceanus moved in slow, deep circles around the rim of the world. I was born in that house. I grew in those halls. And even now, when the horses have been stabled and the cup rocks gently on the dark water and the world below sleeps, I find myself returning to it in memory, not as a place, as a feeling, a particular quality of light. My father was Hyperion. His name meant the one who goes above. And he carried that name the way a king carries his crown, not with effort, simply with certainty. He was a Titan, older than most things that call themselves old. He was the divine principle of heavenly light itself, not the light that falls on grass and stone, but the older thing that stands behind it, the fire that makes fire possible. When he moved through the halls of the Eastern Palace, the walls seemed to remember they were made of something luminous. My mother was Thea. She was the goddess of the shining sky, of bright things seen from far away, of the gleam on water, the glitter of precious stone, the cold silver of the moon before anyone had thought to give it a name. She was quieter than my father, but no less immense. She would sit at the high windows of the palace and look out across Oceanus, and I would watch her watching, and wonder what she saw that I could not yet see. I was born between them, the child of heavenly light and the shining sky. Before me came my sisters. Selene was the elder. She was born already holding the moon in her hands, or so it seemed. There was always something cool about her, something pulled and tidal, something that moved in patient arcs. Even as a child she was unhurried. She would walk through the palace at night when our parents were sleeping, and the stones where her feet had touched would hold a faint silver glow until morning. I loved her with the easy love of a younger sibling who does not yet understand what the other one carries. Eos came after Selene and before me. She was radiant in a different way, rose-fingered even then, before she had claimed the dawn, before she had taken her place at the gates of the eastern sky. She was always the first one awake. I would find her already standing in the highest courtyard, arms slightly lifted, face turned east, the way a young tree turns toward a light source without being told. She was practicing, I think, learning the direction of herself. And then there was me. I do not know precisely what I looked like in those first days. Memory is unreliable about its own beginnings. But I remember what it felt like to stand in the great hall of the palace and look up at the ceiling, which was open to the sky, and feel something in my chest that rose and could not settle. Something that wanted the height. Something that recognized the arc of the heavens above as a place where I belonged, though I had not yet gone there. The palace sat at the edge of the eastern Oceanus. On one side, the great river. On the other, the dark land where the sky begins to pale before dawn. The horses lived in a stable at the back of the palace, behind bronze doors that were always warm to the touch. I would press my palm flat against that metal as a child and feel the heat move through me. I did not know yet whose horses they were, or that they would become mine. I only knew that something behind those doors breathed with fire, and I was not afraid. My father would disappear at certain hours. He would go up somehow, in the way that divine principles go up, rising above the world to fulfill whatever function preceded mine. I watched him go. I watched him return. The light of the world changed around his movements. I understood this the way a child understands large things, incompletely, but genuinely. He would return and find us at supper, and my mother would look at him, and something would pass between them that I did not have language for. Thea knew what I was. She knew before I did, I think. She would hold my face in her hands sometimes and study me, not searching, but confirming, as if checking that I was still myself, still whole, still bright enough. Her eyes were the colour of the sky an hour before sunrise, not dark, not fully light, that particular shade of blue that knows what is coming. She loved all three of us with the same unbroken steadiness, but there were moments when she would watch me in particular with something that was not quite worry and not quite wonder. Something in between, something that recognized a great burden settling itself quietly inside a small being. The Eastern Palace had gardens. They grew at the edge of Oceanus, where the salt air and the first suggestions of morning light made everything grow strangely, beautifully, flowers that faced east with devotion, trees whose bark was pale gold in certain angles of light. My sisters and I would walk there in the long, unhurried hours of the Titan Age, before the world had been divided and assigned, before the wars that would come, before everything changed. I remember Eos running ahead. I remember Selene moving slowly behind. And I remember myself in the middle, looking up at the path of the sky, tracing the arc that the light made from horizon to horizon, already beginning to understand. In some wordless way, that this path would one day be mine. I was not afraid. Even then, even as a child of the Eastern Palace, the son of Hyperion and Thea, a boy standing in a garden at the edge of the world, I was not afraid of what the sky required. I only wondered if I was ready. The readiness I wondered about was never truly tested in the way I expected. What came first was not my ascent. What came first was the falling. I remember the sound before I understood what it was. A low vibration in the stones of the palace felt through the soles of my feet more than heard through the ears. The Oceanus seemed to slow. Even the horses behind the bronze doors went quiet in a way that felt different from ordinary night quiet. Something had changed in the quality of the world. My father did not come home that evening. I waited in the great hall with the open ceiling. I watched the sky darken through the uncovered arch above me, the way I had watched it darken 1,000 times before, but this time the light left differently. It did not fade the way it faded when Hyperion descended in his patient way, the way a flame is cupped and gentled. It thinned. It weakened. It became something uncertain. I did not yet know what was happening on the other side of the world. I only knew that my mother did not move from the high window that night, and that she did not speak, and that her eyes held something I had never seen in them before, not the between worry and wonder that she sometimes carried when she looked at me. This was older. This was a grief that knew itself. The Titanomachy is a word that came later. At the time, it was simply the war. I learned of it in pieces, the way a child learns of a vast thing by finding its edges one at a time. My father was a prisoner. The earth had shaken. Zeus had risen. The Olympians had taken the sky that had belonged to our kind since before memory. I felt something tighten in my chest that was not quite anger and not quite fear. It sat between them, the way so many things sat between things in those days. Between the old world and the new one, between what I had been born into and what I was now required to inhabit. Selene came to find me standing in the garden. The salt air moved through the pale gold trees, and she stood beside me without speaking for a long moment. Her presence was cool and steady, the way the moon itself is cool and steady. She did not offer explanations or reassurances. She simply stood there, and in her standing there was the acknowledgement that something had ended. The age we had grown up in was over. She said it finally, quietly. The Titans have fallen. Father is in Tartarus. I heard the words. I knew what they meant, in the way you know the shape of a thing before you can hold it. Hyperion, who had risen above the world each day in the way divine principles rise, who had returned to supper with the light of the world still in the lines of his face, was now below the world, below everything. I looked at the sky. The arc was still there. Horizon to horizon, the same path I had traced with my eyes since I was small enough to look up and wonder. The sky had not changed. The path had not moved, but the one who had travelled it was gone. I understood then what was being asked of me, not asked. That is not quite the right word. required is closer. What the world required, without apology, without ceremony, the sun still had to rise. The light still had to cross the sky. The mortals below, those small warm creatures who had only just begun to multiply across the face of the earth, needed the warmth and the growing and the rhythm of the day. My father was not available to provide it. And I was his son. I do not know how long I stood in the garden after Selene told me. She left eventually, moving back toward the palace with her slow, unhurried step. I watched her go, and then I was alone with the pale gold trees and the sound of Oceanus turning at the edge of everything. There was a complexity to what I felt that I am still sorting through, even now. On one side of it was grief, real grief. My father was a Titan lord, ancient and powerful, and he had been defeated and imprisoned in the pit beneath the world. That is not a small thing to carry. I had watched him disappear at certain hours and return with the light still on him, and I had loved him in the specific way a child loves a parent who is also something immense. That love did not vanish because the war had been lost. On the other side was something harder to name. A tension, a pull in two directions at once. Because I was Titan-born, and yet the work I was being asked to take up would now serve the Olympian order, the very order that had defeated my father, that had cast the Titans into Tartarus and reshuffled the architecture of the cosmos. I was not Zeus's enemy. I had not fought in the war. I was too young, and my function was different, and perhaps my function had always been different from the question of who ruled Olympus. The sun does not answer to a throne. It answers to the sky itself, to the necessity of light, to the turning of the world. These things do not change when empires do, but I felt the weight of the position I now occupied. A Titan's son, a Titan's heir. Doing the Titan's work under an Olympian sky. Thea called me inside before dawn. She held my face in her hands the way she sometimes did, that confirming gesture, checking that I was still whole. Her eyes in the near dark were the precise colour of the hour before sunrise. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "You will rise anyway." Not as a question, not as a command exactly. As a recognition of something she had always known was in me, something she had been watching settle quietly into its proper place since I was small enough to press my palm against the bronze doors of the stable. "I will rise," I said, and I held those words afterward, turning them over, not with the simple certainty of a child who does not yet understand what the sky costs, but with the full weight of what I now knew. The war was over. My father was gone. The world had broken and rearranged itself into a new shape. And somewhere on the other side of the eastern horizon, the sky waited for me. The bronze doors of the stable were warm against my palms when I went to them in that final hour before dawn. Behind them, the horses were breathing. I could feel it through the metal. 4 great hearts, burning, patient, waiting for the one who would hold their reins. I was not yet that one, not on that morning. But I stood with my hands flat against the warmth and let the steadiness of their breathing move through me, and I thought about what it meant to continue something that had been interrupted. To pick up a light that had been dropped, not in triumph, but in simple necessity because the world needed it and I was the one who could carry it. The tension did not resolve itself that morning. It has never fully resolved itself. Even now, driving the chariot along the arc, I have travelled more times than I can hold in memory. I carry both things at once, the grief and the rising, the loss and the continuing, the Titan blood and the Olympian sky. I rose the first time when I was not ready, into a world that had just been made new and raw and strange. I rose anyway. The morning of that first rising arrived the way all true beginnings arrive, without announcement, without ceremony, in the quiet accumulation of small preparatory moments that only later are recognized as the threshold they were. I had not slept. There had been no question of sleep. I had stood with my hands against the bronze doors until the warmth of them had become the warmth of my own hands, until I could no longer tell where the metal ended and my palms began. And then, in the hour when the darkness at the eastern edge of the world began to thin, not brighten, simply thin, the way cloth thins when it has been worn long and faithfully, I pressed my weight against the great doors, and they opened. The smell reached me first. There is no other smell like it in the world or above it. Fire and sweat, and something that has no name in any mortal language, the smell of a creature whose blood runs at a temperature that would char wood, whose exhaled breath carries the memory of every mile of sky it has travelled. The 4 horses stood in their separate stalls, each one radiating heat, the way a hearthstone radiates heat, deeply from within, with that particular warmth that has been accumulating for a very long time. Pirua, the fiery one, turned his great head toward me first. His eyes were the colour of the coals that glow deepest in the long hours after a fire has peaked, that dark red orange that is more heat than light. He regarded me with an intelligence that had nothing youthful or uncertain about it. He had carried Hyperion. He knew what carrying meant. He knew what it required of the one who held the reins, and he was measuring me now with the particular patience of a creature who has already seen many things and is willing to observe one more before forming a conclusion. Phaethon stood beside him, brilliant in his own way, his coat the colour of afternoon light on bronze water, shifting between gold and copper depending on the angle from which you looked. He was the one who ran brightest at midday, my mother had told me once, the one whose fire peaked when the sun reached its highest point and the arc of the day bent briefly toward descent. He did not look at me immediately. He was looking at the ceiling of the stable, at some point above and beyond, as though he could already see the path laid out through the ceiling and the sky, as though he was simply waiting for the signal to begin following it. Phlegon was smallest of the 4, if that word can be applied to any of them, and his fire was the most particular. Where Pirua burned red and Phaethon burned gold, Phlegon burned with a white-blue intensity at the core that made looking directly at him a thing you did briefly and then remembered at a careful distance. He was the one who carried the chariot through the high cold reaches of the sky, through the places where the air thins and the stars become visible even at midday to anyone who might be looking down from a great enough height. He stamped once when I entered, and then was perfectly still. And Eos, last of the 4, the one whose name matched my sister's, stood in the 4th stall with a quiet that was different from the quiet of the others. She was steady in a way that the others were steady in fire, not the steadiness of banked heat, but the steadiness of something whose nature is to endure. Her coat caught the pre-dawn dimness and held it as though she had stored it. She would be the one, I sensed even then in that first meeting, whose steadiness I would reach for in the difficult passages of the ark. I moved to each of them in turn. I want to say I spoke to them, but that is not quite accurate. I made sounds that were not words, low and continuous, sounds that were meant to carry the information of my presence across the distance between my species and theirs. I was not Hyperion. They knew this. They had known it the moment the doors opened, because Hyperion carried a particular quality of warmth that was his alone. The way any being who has done a thing for long enough carries the shape of that thing in their body. I did not have that yet. I was new to this, and they could feel my newness the way horses feel everything, in the vibrations of the air, in the small unconscious signals of a body not yet certain of its task. They accepted me anyway. That is the thing I have never forgotten. They did not require me to already be what I was becoming. They stood still while I moved among them, while I checked the fittings of the harness that the stable hands had prepared, while I ran my hands along the great golden traces that connected each horse to the chariot, and the chariot to all of them together. They breathed their burning breath into the cool stable air, and they waited. Thea appeared in the doorway when I was nearly finished. She was wearing the deep blue of the sky at zenith, that saturated darkness that is not night but its own complete thing, the colour the sky holds when it is most fully itself. She had her hands at her sides. She watched me check the final fitting of Pirouase's harness, and she said nothing, and her silence was not the silence of someone who has nothing to say. It was the silence of someone who has said the important things already and has enough wisdom to trust that they were heard. I looked at her once before I climbed up. She nodded. That was sufficient. The chariot itself is a thing I have tried to describe many times, and cannot describe adequately, because it is not simply a vehicle, but a kind of argument, a proof made visible in gold and celestial metal that light can have a shape. The wheel spokes were cast from the same source as my father's aureole, from the raw concentrated brightness that Thea had poured into her children. The specific quality of divine luminescence that distinguishes solar fire from ordinary fire. Standing in it for the first time, feeling its weight transfer subtly to the hooves of the 4 horses, I understood that I was not simply climbing into a conveyance, I was stepping into my inheritance. The eastern horizon was the particular pale grey of something that has not yet decided what it will be. I held the reins. I felt the 4 horses feel my hands on the reins, felt the information pass down through the leather traces from my palms to their mouths, and I felt them register it, each one differently. Pirouase tested the contact with a small pull, measuring my resistance. Phaethon settled lower, finding his working posture. Phlegon was already still, already pointing into the distance with the focus of a creature that understands the task completely. Eos breathed out once, a long, slow breath, and something in her exhale felt to me very much like permission. I released the brake. The chariot lifted. There is no sound for it. Or rather, there is a sound, but it is a sound you feel in the sternum rather than hear in the ears. The horses rose from the earth, and the chariot rose with them, and the stable fell away below, and the palace fell away, and the great river Oceanus fell away. And there was only the sky, vast and receiving, and the path laid across it from east to west, like a road that has been travelled so many times it has worn itself into the fabric of the air. Below me the world was dark, and then it was not. The light moved outward from the chariot in all directions. That particular quality of light that only comes with the sun's full rising, that warmth that reaches into shadow and finds it and dissolves it gently, without violence, the way warmth dissolves cold. The mountains caught it first, their peaks turning gold while their slopes remained in shadow. Then the plains. Then the rivers, each one becoming a seam of light through the landscape, as though the land itself was briefly visible in cross-section, every waterway illuminated from above. I held the reins, and I breathed, and I let the horses carry me along the ancient arc, far below, in the first villages. In the first small fires of human mourning that were just beginning to be laid against the cold, the people looked up. They had not known if it would come. After everything, after the great shaking of the world, the war and the upheaval and the long terrible silence where the sun should have been, they had stood in their fields and looked at the horizon and hoped and not been sure. And there it was, rising as it had always risen, gold and absolute and patient, moving along the sky with the unhurried certainty of something that has decided it will not stop. I thought of my father in the dark below the world, and I rose anyway. The morning settled into its long middle passage. The horses ran in their working rhythm now, not the explosive upward surge of the first ascent, but something steadier, something that had found its own deep groove in the air and would hold it without being asked. Pirouase led from the front with that slow burning certainty I had already come to recognize as his particular character. Not the hot urgency of young fire, but the older, patient confidence of coals that had been burning for a very long time. I watched the world below me as it woke. The coast of the eastern lands came first. Those headlands where the sea met the shore in long white lines of foam, each wave visible from my height as a brief disturbance, a small argument between water and land that was resolved the same way every time. Then the plains opened beyond them, wide and brown, and beginning to green with the season's slow push. I was not thinking, in those early miles, of anything beyond the task immediately before me. And yet she was already there, in the margins of my awareness, as she had been since before I was born. Her name was Clymene. She was the daughter of Oceanus and Tethys, one of the 3,000 Oceanids, those daughters of the great encircling river who moved between the sea and the world's edges like light moves through water. I had seen her first from the chariot on one of those early mornings when I was still learning the ark's subtleties and had the attention to spare for the shores beneath me. She stood where the river Eridanus met the sea. There are places in the world where something about the quality of the light and the quality of the land and the quality of the person standing in that particular light and land resolves into a composition so complete that you understand it at once, with the whole of your attention, without needing to study it. She was standing with her back half toward me and her hair loose and moving in the shore wind, and the morning light was on her in precisely the way morning light finds certain figures and makes them into a kind of argument, a proof, that the world contains more grace than any single day of it can adequately carry. I am the sun. I see everything, but there is a particular way of seeing that is not simply observation. That is something else, something for which no adequate distance exists. What grew between us grew slowly. Clymene was not impetuous in her nature. She moved through the world with a quality of patience that matched the river she favoured, that long, slow-moving river Eridanus that carried its water from the highlands to the sea over such a gradual course that you could stand on its bank and not be certain, from the stillness of it, which direction the current ran. She thought carefully. She considered things from all their angles before she committed to a direction. She was, in this way, utterly unlike me and entirely suited to me. I was the light that had to move. She was the patience that made moving bearable. We had time in the evenings, after the chariot descended and the horses were given to their rest, and the golden cup was prepared for my night crossing of the Oceanus. The twilight hours. The palace at the edge of the world held a particular quiet in those hours that it held at no other time, neither the anticipatory stillness of the hour before rising, nor the deep silence of full night. But something in between. She would sit with me in that twilight. She never spoke much in those hours. This was not discomfort, but its opposite. The ease of someone who has no need to fill silence, because silence is comfortable to them. We would sit in the upper rooms of the Eastern Palace where the windows faced west. With the last light of the day I had just driven across the sky still held faintly on the horizon, we watched my own light go out. There is something strange and quietly humbling about watching the afterglow of your own passage fade from the western sky. I drove that light across the world all day, held it in the chariot, guided it along the arc, and then at the end of each evening I watched it become only the memory of itself on the edge of the world. Clymene watched it with me, and did not feel the need to say anything about it. That was worth a great deal to me. The child came in the ordinary way, or what passes for ordinary when one parent is the Titan who carries the sun, and the other is a daughter of the world ocean. There is always something unusual about such arrivals, some quality in the child that announces, before the child is old enough to announce anything, what it is. Phaethon was born in the very early morning, the hour before my rising, the thin, uncertain darkness that I have known all my life as the hour of beginning. He arrived into that hour the way a torch arrives in a dark room, with an abruptness that changes everything about the space it enters. He glowed. Not metaphorically. He was warm to the touch in a way that no newborn of purely mortal or even purely divine origin would be warm. He carried within him, from the first breath, the particular signature warmth of solar fire, diluted, yes, filtered through Clymene's oceanic nature into something that would not ignite the receiving hands, but unmistakable to anyone who knew what they were feeling. I held him in the low light of that pre-dawn hour. He opened his eyes. They were gold. That particular shade of gold that lives in the centre of a flame deeper than the yellow of the outer flame, warmer, more complete. He looked up at me, and I felt, in that moment, the particular weight of being looked at by your own child for the first time. The weight of being recognized by something that has no context for you yet, that is only finding what it finds and responding to it. I held him very carefully. Clymene was watching from the low bed, her hair loose against the pillow, her breathing still carrying the effort of what she had just accomplished. She watched me hold the child with her quiet eyes, and in them I saw something I did not name to myself in that moment. Something I would only understand later, in other lights, in other circumstances. She was watching with a love that was also something else. A carefulness. A particular quality of attention that was not worry exactly, not yet, but was perhaps the first small seed of what worry grows from when it is given time and reason. The child glowed in my hands. He was looking up past my shoulder at the ceiling, or at something beyond the ceiling, through the stone and wood of the palace, up toward the place where the sky waited, as though he already knew where the important things were, as though some direction had already been decided for him before he was old enough to decide anything. Clymene watched him look upward. She reached out, and I placed him in her arms. She held him against her, and he was still looking up. His small face with those gold-fire eyes turned toward the ceiling of the room, toward whatever he was finding up there in the dark wood and the dark stone and the dark sky beyond. She smoothed his hair with one careful hand. Her face was quiet, but her eyes were the eyes of someone who can already see, just barely, at the very edge of their vision, the shape of something coming toward them from a very great distance. Something that is still too far away to make out clearly, too far away to be certain of, but present nonetheless. Present in the way that certain things are present before they arrive. Present in the tilt of a child's face toward the sky. He came to the palace when he was perhaps 16 years old. I knew he was coming before he arrived. This is one of the conditions of being what I am. I see the roads as I pass over them. I see the figures moving along them. I had watched him walking for 3 days, heading east, following the course of the shoreline, his face set toward the place where the sky and the sea come together. His hair caught the light the way mine does. Even from the height of the chariot I recognized that. I recognized that glow. He arrived at the Eastern Palace in the early morning, the hour just after my departure. He would have passed through the great doors while I was already ascending, already committed to the ark. My daughters told me later how he came. How he stood in the entrance hall and looked around at everything with those gold-fire eyes, taking in the columns and the high ceilings and the way the morning light fell through the eastern windows in long, hot slants. He was looking for me, and I was already gone. This is one of the sorrows I carry. I could not be there to receive him. The chariot does not stop for family arrivals. The world does not dim its morning because a boy has come looking for his father. He waited. He was patient in the way of someone who has been patient for a very long time already. 16 years of not knowing, or half knowing, or knowing but having no proof to press into the hands of those who doubted him. He sat in the entrance hall of my palace, and he waited until the day crossed itself and began its descent, and eventually I came home. I remember the moment I saw him standing in the courtyard. He was tall. He had Clymene's stillness about him, that quality of patience that she carried like a cloak. But everything else was mine. The warmth that came off him, that faint radiance that was not visible in full daylight, but that you could feel if you stood close enough. The eyes. The particular way he held his jaw, tilted very slightly upward. Still looking at the sky, even now. Even standing in a courtyard with stone beneath him. We spoke for a long time that evening. He told me how it had been growing up in the mortal world with the rumours of his parentage following him, how other boys had called him a liar when he claimed what he claimed, how even those who believed him sometimes looked at him with that measuring quality, that comparison against expectations, and found him unfinished. I listened to all of it. There is a particular kind of silence I know how to hold, not the silence of having nothing to say, but the silence of understanding that what a person is saying requires space around it. Clymene taught me that in the upper rooms of the palace, watching my afterglow fade from the western sky. I held that silence for my son. When he had said everything he had come to say, he looked at me for a long moment. Then he asked, "I want to drive the chariot." I heard those words, and something shifted in my chest. Not a pain exactly. More, the weight of knowing what cannot be moved. Because I had sworn by the Styx, I need to explain what that means for anyone who has not felt it. The Styx is not merely a river. It is the oldest oath-binding force that exists. When a god swears by the Styx, that promise becomes something outside of them. It is no longer held inside the god's own will. It exists separately, like a chain that has been attached and cannot be removed by the one who attached it. Zeus himself will not break an oath sworn on those black waters. Some time before this morning, in a moment of love and pride and the particular recklessness that love and pride can produce together, I had sworn it. I had looked at my boy, younger then, and I had told him, "Ask me for anything." And I had sworn by the Styx that I would grant it. I had not known, in that moment, what the asking would be, so I told him the truth about the route. I told him about the first part of the ascent, when the horses climb so steeply that even I must brace against the force of it. When Pirwa leads, and the others follow, and the whole chariot shudders with the effort of rising. The mortal world grows small below, and then smaller, and then too small to look at without the vertigo becoming something dangerous. I told him about the high middle passage, the place where the heat is not external, but fills everything, where the chariot itself becomes part of the fire, and you must be something that can hold fire without being consumed by it. I told him this was not a matter of skill or courage. It was a matter of what you are made of at the most fundamental level. I told him about the constellations, the Great Bear who does not set, who circles the pole in her endless turning, watching everything that passes through her territory with an ancient, unforgiving attention. Scorpius, who waits in the lower part of the arc, whose claws extend across the path, and whose presence causes the horses to know something a boy holding their reins would not know, that there is a malevolence there that is not metaphor. The horses know these things. They respond to them. They have driven this path with me for the full span of the world, and still Scorpius makes them quicken and pull. He listened to all of this carefully. His face was attentive in the way of someone who is taking in information to weigh against something already decided. This is what I could see, and what I could not change. He had already decided. I told him about the descent, how the final plunge toward the western sea requires a resistance of the full reins, a leaning back against the pull of the horses with everything you have, that the angle of the descent is severe enough that the chariot tilts forward and the world below comes up fast and wrong. I told him that other gods had ridden with me and found the high passage difficult. I told him the horses felt riderless already if a hand held their reins that was not mine. He was quiet when I finished. The courtyard had gone dim around us. The last light I had pulled across the sky was releasing itself into the western dark. He looked at me. His gold eyes held that last light for a moment before it faded. "Father," he said, "you swore." He was right. I had sworn. The Styx was around that promise like stone around a root, and no amount of love, no quantity of good reason, no father's fear could reach in and remove it. I looked at my son standing in the fading light of my own day. He glowed faintly in the gathering dark. The oath was done. The answer was yes. And all the truth I had told him about the height and the heat and the claws of Scorpius would ride with him only as words, not as the bone knowing that would have been required to make them mean something useful. I reached out and put my hand briefly on his shoulder. He was warm. He had always been warm, from the very first hour of his life, warm in a way that had always made me proud and that now made me afraid. The night Phaethon slept under my roof I could not sleep at all. I lay in the inner rooms of the Eastern Palace and listened to the darkness outside. The horses were in their stable, breathing in the slow rhythms of rest. The courtyard was empty. Somewhere in the upper rooms my son's warmth moved through the walls like a low, steady heat from a fire that burns without needing to be fed. I did not go in to look at him. There are moments a father knows he must not interrupt. Sleep was one of them. I lay still and let my memory move the way it moves when sleep refuses to come, sideways, backward, into other times and other faces. It went, as it often does in the deep hours, to Circe. She was not like Clymene. Clymene had stillness in her, the way still water has depth, a quality of holding everything without agitation. Circe was different. She had the quality of the sea at its middle distance, neither crashing nor calm, always in motion, always luminous. She was the daughter of Oceanus, as Clymene was, but where Clymene held the shore, Circe held the open water. I remember the quality of her light. She did not glow exactly, she reflected. Everything I carried, every beam that fell through me into the world, she took and gave it back, changed, cooler, more refined. Something I gave became something else in her. 3 children came from that. I think about this sometimes in the night. That the same fire, moving through different vessels, produces such different shapes of being. The first was Aeetes. He came into the world with something already decided in him, a purpose that was not borrowed from either of his parents, but was simply present from his first breath. Even as a child, he did not ask what he was meant to hold. He simply held things. A branch, a stone. Later, a kingdom. He moved to Colchis while still young, sailing east along the rim of the world to where the river Phaethon runs down from the mountains. From above, I watched his ship crossing the dark water. He did not look up. He was already looking forward toward the shore that would become his. He built his palace on the eastern shore, near the grove of the war god, and there he placed what I trusted him with. The fleece that hung in the oak tree, the great golden weight of it shining in the dark of the grove. There were things I could not carry with me in the chariot, things that needed to be kept in the world rather than above it. Aeetes understood this without needing it explained. From above, I could always see the grove. The gold of it caught my light back at me each morning as I passed overhead. A signal, I used to think, a small, steady answer. The second was Circe. She arrived into the world asking questions with her eyes before she could ask them with words. What is that? Why does that move? What does the inside of that look like? She was always turning things over, looking beneath, pressing her fingers into the underside of things to see what lived there. She took her island eventually, Aeaea, somewhere in the Western Sea. I confess I am not always sure exactly where it sits. Islands shift. She may have something to do with that. From above, smoke rises from her island at certain hours, thin and fragrant, not alarmed smoke. The smoke of something deliberate being done. I can see the shape of the island, the dense trees, the small cleared space where her house sits. Occasionally a shape that might be an animal and is not quite. She does not look up when I pass. She learned early that looking up at me directly is not advisable, even for children of mine, but sometimes. Very early in the morning, when I am just lifting above the horizon, and my light has not yet acquired its full weight, I catch the pale oval of her face tilted toward the sky, just briefly. The way you check on a parent you know is always there, but still need to see. Then she looks back down at whatever she is doing. The third was Pacify. She went to Crete. She married Minos. She became a queen, which is a thing that some people wear like a garment, and some people become in the bone. Pasiphae became it in the bone. She walked the halls of Knossos with the precise authority of someone who has never needed to raise her voice. She did not need to. People simply understood when she was near that certain things were true. She carried my fire in a different form than the other two, not as a drive toward possession like Aeetes, not as insatiable curiosity like Circe. Pasiphae held it as will, as a kind of absolute insistence on what she believed was real, even when what she believed was real became something the world did not want to accommodate. I loved her for this. I also worried about it in the way that gods can worry about qualities in their children that are simply larger versions of their own. From the chariot. Crete is a long, pale shape in the blue water of the Aegean. On certain afternoons, when the light is flat and even, I can see the pattern of the palace laid out below. The labyrinthine shape of it. The famous complication. I do not look long. There are things even the all-seeing God chooses to pass over. These were the thoughts that moved through me that night, while Phaethon slept in the upper rooms. 3 children from one kind of fire, and now this 4th child, sleeping under my roof for the first time, carrying warmth in a way that none of the others had. A warmth that was not Perse's refracted gleam, not Clymene's steady shore light. It was mine. Undiluted. This was what frightened me. The others had transformed what I gave them into something workable, something that could be held by human hands and human hours and human places in the world. Aeetes turned it into possession and will. Circe turned it into knowledge and transformation. Pasiphae turned it into sovereignty. All of them had made it smaller in some necessary way. The way water becomes manageable when it runs in a defined channel. Phaethon had not transformed it. He had simply kept it, and there is no channel made for that. There is no human hour that can contain undiluted sun. There is no hand in the world shaped to hold what I hold without being built for exactly that purpose. Across an eternity of practice, I lay in the dark and listened to the horses breathe. The stable sounds, the deep exhalation of Pirwa, who always breathes loudest in rest. The small movements of the others settling. They would not rest long. Before the sky fully darkened, some part of them would begin to prepare for morning. The way creatures born to a single purpose cannot entirely release that purpose even in sleep. I thought about the morning that was coming. I thought about the reins. The reins are not a simple thing. They are an extension of me in a way that is difficult to explain. When I hold them, I do not feel them as separate. They become part of the arc I describe across the sky, part of the conversation between my will and the horse's power and the path that the world requires me to hold. When another hand holds them, the horses know. I had not told Phaethon this clearly enough. I had told him the horses would feel the difference. But I had not told him what that difference means in practice. In the first moment of the ascent, when Pyroas tests the weight of whoever is guiding him, Pyroas tests everything. Always. He has been doing it since before the world had its current shape. He pulls slightly left at the start of the ascent, not from habit, but from intention. He wants to know what is holding him. He wants to know if it can be trusted. I always resist the pull without thinking. It has become part of the motion of beginning. Phaethon would not know to resist it. He would feel the pull and perhaps correct it, or perhaps he would be startled by it, or perhaps in the excitement of being there at all, in the joy of the first rising, he would not notice it until Pirwa had already taken some portion of the path himself. And once Pirwa takes the path, the others follow. I close my eyes in the dark. Above me, through the thick walls of the palace, I could feel the warmth of my sun, still burning gently. Still whole, for this one night, still safe. The morning came the way I knew it would, not with ceremony, not with any particular sign, just the horses stirring before the sky changed, and the slow pressure of dawn building in my blood the way it always does. A warmth that is not separate from me, but is me, returning to its necessary work. I heard Phaethon on the stairs before I saw him. His step was quick. The step of someone who has been awake for a long time already, waiting for permission to move. He came to me in the outer hall, and his face was everything I had feared it would be. Open, radiant, utterly certain. He looked the way I imagine I looked once in some age before memory, when the task of rising was still new enough to feel like wonder instead of duty. He said, "I am ready," and I believed him. That was the cruelest part. He was not lying. He was not pretending. He had gathered himself through the long dark hours and arrived at a genuine readiness, and that readiness was simply not the right instrument for what was coming. I put the helmet on him myself. The solar aureole, which I have worn since before Rhodes rose from the sea, which carries a heat that does not diminish at any altitude. I set it on his head and watched his face change with the weight of it. Not pain. He did not flinch from pain. Something more like recognition. Like, ah, this is what it is. I showed him the reins one final time. He held them correctly. His hands were the right shape. He had been watching me his entire life through Clymena's stories, through the long imagining of someone who grows up looking at the sky and thinking, that is my father. He had formed some true picture of the gesture, but a picture of a thing, and the thing itself occupied different worlds. We walked to the chariot together. The horses were already restless. Pyroas turned his head and looked at Phaethon directly, the long equine assessment of something new. The others shifted their weight. Aethon, who is the quietest of them at rest, stamped once against the pale stone floor and was still. They knew. Phaethon climbed into the chariot. He stood there, and for a moment everything was suspended. The eastern sky beginning to open behind him. The chariot gold in that first gradual light. My son standing where I have stood for longer than the Olympian order has existed. He looked at me. I could have said anything. I had all night to find the right words, and I had not found them, and now there was no more night. I said, "Hold the middle path." He said, "I know." He did not know, but I had sworn by the Styx, and the Styx holds what it holds, and there is no force in any of the three realms that breaks such an oath. Not grief, not foresight, not a father's wish that he had chosen different words on a different night before the binding was made permanent. Eos had already opened the rose-coloured gates ahead of him. She does not know, I thought. She opens them every morning without question, and this morning she opened them for my son. Not knowing, not having been told, the horses went forward, and I stood in the courtyard of my eastern palace and watched. Pyroas pulled left. I saw it from the ground, the slight deviation at the first moment of ascent, the familiar test. I saw Phaethon's hands move. He corrected it. For one moment I thought, perhaps the correction is enough. Perhaps the knowledge inside him, the undiluted fire, will serve where training cannot. Then Pyroas pulled left again, harder. And this time Phaethon overcorrected, and Aethon, feeling the shift, took it as a new instruction, and Phlegon followed Aethon, and in the space of a few moments the horses were no longer on the path I have held across the sky since the Titans held dominion. They were climbing. Too steeply, too fast. The chariot rose at an angle. The sky was not made to receive, and the heat that Phaethon carried, his own heat, my heat, undiluted, met the heat of the chariot and the horse's breath and the altitude, and the path below him was wrong by enough that no correction could rebuild it. I watched it happen. This is the thing I carry, that I watched it. I am the all-seeing God, which means I cannot turn away, and I could not turn away from this. I saw every moment of the deviation. I saw the mountains of Thessaly catch the scorching air from below the wrong arc of the chariot and go dry and pale with heat. I saw the great rivers recoil from the burning sky, the Nile pulling its waters southward, the rivers of Libya sinking into themselves until their beds showed bare stone. The earth called out. Gaia herself, who predates every deity who has ever claimed dominion over her surface, raised her voice. I heard it from the courtyard, a sound not made of air but of deep stone and ancient ground, a cry that carries differently than any other sound. She was burning. She was asking for it to stop. Zeus heard her. He is always listening for that particular voice. Whatever else may be said of the king of Olympus, he does not ignore the earth when the earth speaks at that register. I saw the thunderbolt form in the high air before it struck. A column of white light, precise, without hesitation. Zeus does not aim poorly, and he does not linger over what he has decided. The bolt took Phaethon out of the chariot. His hands released the reins. The horses, freed from any guiding weight at all, slowed in their confusion, and I was already moving, already ascending to take them back. Because the world below needed the path restored, and I am the one who holds the path, and I have never in all the ages of the world failed to hold it. I caught the reins at the high point of the sky, above the place where Phaethon had lost them. The horses steadied. Pyrois pulled left once, briefly, and I resisted, and he settled. The path held. Phaethon fell through the long air, bright and diminishing, toward the river Eridanus far below. He fell the way a star falls, visible, trailing light, and then gone into the dark water. I finished the arc. I completed the crossing, west to east, sky road to ocean cup, the way I have always done. The world needed the day completed, and so I completed it. But I felt where he had been in my hands. The reins remembered the shape of his grip, the brief interval of a different pair of hands, young and certain and not quite enough. The river Eridanus received him, far below. On the banks of that northern river, someone was already running toward the water. I could see from above. It was Clymene first, then the others, his sisters. My daughters by Clymene, running toward where my son had gone in. They reached the bank. They stood at the edge of the water looking in. I descended toward the western ocean. The chariot settling into the great gold cup, the horses folding into themselves. The day was done. The path was kept. My son was in the river. The still water quality that Clymene had always carried. She stood at the bank of the Eridanus, and I could see it even from this altitude. Still, completely still, holding the shore in the way that has always been her nature, even when the shore itself is grief. The days that followed were unlike any I had known. I rose. I always rise. That is the thing that cannot be stopped, not by grief, not by anything that moves through the three realms. The world needs the light, and so I give it, and the mechanism of that giving does not pause to consider what it costs. But the morning after Phaethon fell, I did not rise. This is the memory I carry with some difficulty, because it is the memory in which I failed the world in a way I had never before permitted myself to fail it. The chariot stood in the eastern courtyard. The horses were harnessed. Eos had opened the gates, the way she opens them every morning, not knowing, not asking. The sky beyond the gates was the colour of pale rose and waiting. I stood at the threshold and did not go through. The world below went dark longer than it should have. The hours passed that were supposed to be filled with light, and instead there was a deep grey stillness over everything, the particular grey of a dawn that arrives and then fails to become morning. I have been told that mortals wept, that animals stood uncertain in their fields, that the birds, who wake to my light and read their directions by it, gathered in confused silence on bare branches. I could not make myself move. The gods noticed. They notice everything, eventually, the way anything notices a mechanism that has suddenly stopped. Voices came to me at the threshold. I do not remember all of them clearly. Some I did not recognize, some I knew well. They spoke careful words. They said, "The world requires it." They said, "This is your nature and your charge." They said what they needed to say. Eventually I went through the gate, not because the words convinced me, because I looked down and saw the darkness lying over the land, and I understood that my grief, held this way, was becoming another scorching, a different kind. And I had already given enough of that. I rose. I carried the day across the sky. I completed the arc. But that single grey morning lived in me for a long time after. What I did not see during those first days was what was happening on the banks of the Eridanus. I was above, tracing my path, watching the world as I always watch it. But there are things the all-seeing eye can observe without fully receiving. The mind takes in what it can bear and processes the rest more slowly. And so the transformation on the river bank reached me gradually, in pieces, over several crossings. My daughters were still there. Clymene had gone eventually, I do not know when. One crossing she was at the bank, still as stone, and some crossing later she was not. The stillness had simply relocated itself inside her and carried on somewhere else. That is Clymene's nature. She absorbs and continues. She does not shatter. But my daughters by her, the ones who had run to the bank behind her, they had not moved. They stood at the edge of the water where Phaethon had gone down. They stood there through one sunrise, and then another, and then many more. They did not eat, they did not speak. Their grief had a quality I had not witnessed before in any child of mine, a kind of focused and absolute mourning that was less like emotion and more like weather, like a condition that had settled over them and was not going to lift. They wept without ceasing. This is the detail I carry, the tears. They ran down my daughters' faces in long, unbroken lines, and where each tear fell to the ground and to the bark of the young poplars growing close to the bank, it hardened. Dried gold, caught in the wood and the earth like something trapped mid-motion. Amber, I understood when I first saw it from my height what I was watching. Grief made permanent. The tears of daughters of the sun carrying enough of that solar heat that they cooled into something solid. Something that would last past the span of the grief itself, past the lives that generated it. The gods saw it too. The transformation was not sudden. That is the other thing I remember. It was gradual. A slow giving of their bodies to the river bank, their feet first. Then their legs, becoming still in the way that wood is still, the way something is still when its stillness is no longer chosen but structural. Their arms elongating upward, the fingers finding the old gesture of grief and holding it until what had been gesture became form, poplars pale and slender. On the northern bank of the Eridanus, the Helios, my daughters, lambent with their own amber tears, which still seep from the white bark on certain mornings, gathered by those who know what they are gathering, sold in markets far from that river as something merely beautiful, merely old. Those who sell it do not always know what sorrow made it. Those who wear it at their throats do not always know whose weeping they carry. But I know. Every crossing, when the art brings me over that northern stretch of river, I see the poplars on the bank. I see the faint gold gleam of hardened tears caught in the bark. They do not speak. They cannot. That is the nature of their transformation, which was not a cruelty, but a mercy of a particular kind. The gods understood that the grief was going to consume them entirely, and so they gave it something to become, better amber than nothing. Better a form that holds the light than a dissolution into it. I told myself that for many years. Some years I believed it more than others. The amber falls into the river eventually. The river carries it, pale gold, tumbling in the current, southward and westward, until it reaches shores where people find it washed up among the ordinary stones. The old stories say this is why amber has always been precious, always been associated with mourning, always been placed on altars and in graves, because of where it came from, because of the weeping that made it. I do not know how much of that is true, and how much is the way grief acquires legend over time, the way any loss, held long enough, begins to explain the shape of the world. What I know is what I saw, my daughters running to the bank. The long stillness that followed, the slow giving of human form back to the river bank. And then the poplars, standing in the particular silver-green way that poplars stand, leaves turning in any small wind, restless even when they cannot move. The way my children had always been restless, in the way the children of the sun are restless, always reaching toward the light they carry inside them. The Eridanus kept Phaethon. The bank kept my daughters in the only form their grief permitted them. And the amber moved on in the current, carrying the last of that old warmth out to distant shores, where strangers held it up to whatever light was available and noticed, without knowing why they noticed, that it seemed to glow from within. There is a particular quality to knowing something you did not choose to know. I have thought about this often in the long crossings since. The way certain things are simply given to you by the nature of what you are. No decision precedes them. No moment of choosing whether to look. You look because looking is your function, and then the knowledge is inside you. And there is nothing to be done about it. This is what it means to be all-seeing. Most who speak of my sight speak of it as a gift. I have heard the word in prayers, in oaths, in the dedications mortals leave at my temples along the coast roads where the light falls long in the afternoon. They name me Panoptes. They ask me to witness their vows and hold the memory of them against the possibility of betrayal. They trust that I forget nothing. They are right that I forget nothing. They do not always consider what that costs. I was somewhere over the Aegean when I first noticed them. Below me, on a hillside facing the sea. The particular shift to shadow that meant two bodies moving where bodies should not be, at an hour when the house of Hephaestus was empty and its master away at his forge on Lemnos. There is no mistaking certain things from my height. The pattern of it was clear. The unhurried ease of it spoke of a habit long established. Ares and Aphrodite. I passed over them that first morning and said nothing. This is the other thing about seeing everything. You learn to hold what you have seen quietly, the way a cup holds water, while you consider what is right to do with it. I crossed the western horizon and descended into the cup, and on the dark river Oceanus I held it the way I hold many things, turning it in my mind while the horses rested and the water moved beneath me in the dark. The question was not whether what I had witnessed was true. Truth was not the question. The question was the more difficult one of what to do with truth, once it has come to you without being asked for. I thought about Hephaestus. I knew him well enough, in the way that one who watches all things comes to know the particular quality of a life. I had watched him labour at his forge on many mornings, the sparks rising from Lemnos in thin columns of orange light, visible from my ark, constant. I had watched the work of his hands come into the world, the golden net of stars, the palaces, the automata that moved as though they breathed. His was a precise and patient intelligence. He made things that held. He had made things for me, too. The chariot, the axle and the wheel. The housing for the fire that the horses pulled across the vault of heaven. When I went to him, I went carefully. There is no soft way to tell a man what I had to tell him, so I did not attempt softness. I told him plainly. I told him that what I had seen was not uncertain. I told him who and where and how many times the shadows had made the same pattern on that hillside. Hephaestus did not weep. He went still in the way of a craftsman who has just identified a structural flaw and is already calculating the solution. He thanked me. The word was ordinary and quiet and carried more weight in it than most thanksgivings I have received. Then he went back to his forge. I returned to my ark. I watched over the following days as he worked. The net he made was extraordinary even by his standards, fine as hair, bright as the surface of still water, invisible to any eye that was not mine. He constructed it with the kind of care that comes from somewhere beyond craft, the way certain works are made not only with the hands, but with the full force of what the maker cannot otherwise express. He hung it from the bedposts of Aphrodite's chamber and stepped back. He left for Lemnos, or appeared to. From my height, I watched the chamber. I watched the net hang there, patient in the way that well-made traps are patient, without urgency, without impatience, just waiting to be what it was made to be. And then the two of them came. The net fell closed around them when they did not expect it. It held. Of course it held. He had made it. What I had not entirely anticipated was what came after. Hephaestus summoned the gods to witness it. I watched them come, one after another, across the distance between Olympus and that chamber. I watched Hermes and Apollo arrive, watched the laughter move through them at the sight of the two caught there, tangled and motionless and exposed. The laughter was not entirely unkind, but it was not entirely kind either. These things rarely are, when the private is made public. Poseidon came later, more sombre. He negotiated quietly for the release. I watched all of it from the ark, and here is what I carry from that memory, not satisfaction, not anything clean. Only the awareness that I had set this in motion by saying what I had seen, that my testimony had a shape to it, a consequence, and that the consequence was not mine to control once the words had left me. I told the truth because I had witnessed it, and because what I had witnessed was mine to speak. But the net, the summoning, the laughter, the exposure, the particular cruelty of that moment in the chamber, those were not mine. They grew from my words the way things grow from seeds, taking their own form. This is the weight of always seeing, not that seeing leads inevitably to harm, but that it leads inevitably somewhere, and you follow it with your testimony, and then you watch the consequence from your height, unable to alter what your words have made. I am not Hephaestus's grief, and I am not Aphrodite's shame. I am only the light that fell through the window and saw what was there. But I have wondered, in the long crossings, how Aphrodite regards me now. Whether she looks at the place in the sky where I travel and feels, not warmth, but the particular unease of one who has been watched without knowing it, caught by a light that held no malice and no mercy either, only vision. I have wondered whether Hephaestus, in his forge on Lemnos, with the sparks rising on certain mornings in those thin orange columns, considers that I gave him something when I came to him, or whether he considers only what I took away. The possibility of not knowing. There is a kind of peace in not knowing. I cannot offer it to anyone, not because I wish to keep it from them, because I do not have it myself. From the ark I see everything. The amber on the Eridanus bank, the smoke from Lemnos, the particular angle of shadow on an Aegean hillside in early morning, the net, long since dissolved or repurposed into something else, the chamber empty. All the figures dispersed back into their own lives. Only the light remains the same. And I, who carry it, still crossing. There is a memory I return to differently than the others. The others come with feeling already attached. The fall of Phaethon carries grief before the image even forms. The Helios on the Eridanus bank carry the particular ache of witnessing transformation I could not prevent. The net in the chamber carries something more complicated, a residue I have already described and will not reopen here, but the memory of Rhodes comes to me clean. It comes the way certain mornings arrive over the Aegean, without announcement, without the kind of weight that asks you to feel something before you have even looked. The gods were dividing the world. I remember the quality of that crossing. An ordinary ark, or what passes for ordinary when you have made the crossing enough times that your hands know the reins without consulting memory. Pyrrha and Phaethon were steady that day. Phlegon ran slightly wide toward the southern reach, as he sometimes does in the hours before noon. Eos held the inside line with her usual discipline. Below, the lands spread out the way they always do from the ark, coastlines, river mouths. The grey-green mass of forest across the northern ranges, the dusty plains of the interior where roads make their slow arguments across the land. I was not thinking of the lottery. This is the part I have thought about over many crossings. I was not thinking of it. The gods had gathered, and they had drawn their portions, and by the time I descended into the west and brought the chariot to rest and let the horses drink from the dark Oceanus, the divisions had already been made and sealed and ratified. No portion had been set aside for me. I only learned this after. There is something that happens when you discover you have been overlooked that is neither anger nor sorrow, but a kind of suspension. A moment where the mind holds the fact at arm's length and simply considers it, examines it from different sides. I was driving the sky when they divided the earth. I was doing the one work that could not be paused. There was no decision in my absence. There was only the ark and the horses and the light falling where it fell, and the world below receiving it without knowing who carried it. The oversight was not malicious. Zeus acknowledged this readily. The lottery had proceeded. The portions had been taken. There was nothing remaining to give. I accepted this. And then something shifted in my attention, the way attention shifts when the eye catches movement at the edge of the arc. I looked down. There was an island rising, not all at once, not with drama. The sea was pulling back in the way of a low tide at its lowest point, and beneath where the water had been, something golden was appearing. A ridge of rock, then terraced slopes, then a shoreline curving in a long gentle arc along the eastern Aegean. The island was called Rhodes. It was new, or rather it had been beneath the sea, and now it was not. The water streamed from its hillsides in thin silver lines, catching my light as it ran back toward the shore. The slopes were beginning already to show the green that comes when warmth touches wet ground. There was nothing built there, no temple, no road, no harbour wall. Only land that had not yet been claimed, because until that morning it had not yet existed in a form that could be claimed. I watched it for the rest of that crossing. The way the eastern cliffs caught the angle of my light and held it gold orange, the same gold as the chariot's rail when the sun sits at midday. The way the harbours to be were visible already in the natural curves of the coast, the places where ships would one day rest at anchor in blue water. I claimed it. Not with a declaration, not with thunder, not with the ceremony that other gods bring to possession. I simply looked at it from my height and understood that it was mine. When I descended that evening, I went to Zeus. He heard me. He considered the fact of my absence from the lottery, the fact that the island had been beneath the sea when the portions were drawn, and so could not have been assigned to any claimant. He considered the island itself, now risen and resting in the Aegean, with its eastern cliffs still streaming light. He honoured the claim. And here is the thing I find myself returning to. In the long crossings, when memory surfaces without being called, Rhodes was not compensation. I want to be precise about this. It would be easy to say that the island was given to me in exchange for the oversight, a portion awarded in correction of an error, but that framing makes it smaller than it was. The island rose from the sea on the day of the lottery. It rose into my light. It rose, in a sense, because of my light, the way all growing things rise toward warmth. It had always been, in some quality of its stone and its eastern aspect, oriented toward what I carry. When I pass over Rhodes on the daily arc, I notice it differently than I notice other places. There is a quality of attention in the act of looking at something you have named as yours. Not possessiveness, not the kind of watching that wants to guard and restrict. Something quieter, the recognition of a particular fit between a place and the one who sees it. The Rhodians understood this without being told. They built temples on those eastern cliffs. They made offerings in my name at the hour when the first light reaches the harbour. Their sailors learned to read the quality of my rising as a sign of the weather to come. They looked up at the ark and found their own portion of meaning in it, the way inhabitants of a place always find meaning in the sky above the land they know, the greatest image they made of me. I have watched constructed from my height. Bronze, vast, standing at the harbour mouth with the ships passing below. The craftsman worked for years. I watched the scale of it take shape against the harbour, and felt something that I do not have a simple name for. Recognition, perhaps, that a mortal mind had looked at the ark above them and made, with its own hands, a form that corresponded to what it had seen. The statue is long since gone. An earthquake brought it down in the end. The bronze tumbling into the harbour in a slow catastrophe of sound and collapse that I watched from the ark on a morning when the sky was otherwise clear. The land remained. The eastern cliffs still catch my light at the same angle. The natural harbours still hold the same curves. The hillsides still go green in spring when warmth and water meet. A portion of the world that was mine, because it rose toward me on the day everything else was already spoken for. I descended into the west that evening, as I descend every evening, and the horses drank from the Oceanus in the dark. And Rhodes sat in the Aegean behind me, still holding the last of the day's colour in its stone. There is a memory that arrives differently from the others, not with grief attached to it, the way the Eridanus memories arrive. Not with the complicated residue of the net in the chamber. This one comes with something closer to amusement. If amusement is the right word for what a god feels when a mortal points a weapon at the sky, Heracles drew his bow at me. I want to say that plainly before anything else. He stood on the shore at the edge of the world's western margin, where the land narrows down toward the sea strait and the sun beats hardest in the afternoon hours. And he drew his bow and aimed an arrow at the blazing disk of my chariot. I was at full height that day. Midday. The horses running level across the top of the ark, Phaethon wide on his usual southern drift, Eos steady and contained on the inside line. The chariot rail was catching its own reflection back at me, that particular gold that has no cooler equivalent in the world below, and there was this figure on the shore. Enormous, as mortals go. I see them all from above, and the difference between a tall man and a short one is a small thing at my altitude. But Heracles was different, even from the distance of the ark. There was a density to him that other mortals do not carry. He stood at the water's edge with his lion skin across his shoulders and his bow raised, and I understood immediately what he wanted, the cup. My golden cup. The vessel I use for the crossing, the bowl of beaten gold that holds me and the horses through the night river while the world sleeps. He was on a labour. He needed to reach an island on the far side of the Oceanus, past where ships go. He had calculated, or intuited, that there was only one vessel adequate for the crossing. He was not wrong. But his method of requesting it was singular. The arrow came up. I watched the angle of his arm. He had calculated the arc correctly, which itself was notable. Most mortals who look up at my crossing do not truly assess the geometry of it. They see the light and feel the warmth, and understand very little about the actual path being travelled. Heracles had looked at the sky with the same attention he brought to everything, and he had found the precise angle. He held the draw. I did not swerve. The horses continued on their line. Phaethon settled slightly from his southern reach as the afternoon deepened, and Eos held where she always holds, and the chariot moved forward across the blue vault of the sky with the same steadiness it maintains every day. Every crossing, from the first morning until the present one. What I felt in that moment is not a simple thing to name. There was no fear in it, no anger either, though the audacity was extraordinary. What arrived instead was a kind of recognition, the same recognition I had felt watching the Rhodian craftsman build the bronze image at the harbour, the sense that something here corresponded accurately to its subject. Heracles had looked at the ark and understood it truly. He had assessed what he needed, found the one thing that could provide it, and made his demand in the only language available to him. He could not call up to me. He could not send a messenger. He could not negotiate from a position of leverage in any conventional sense. So he aimed at the sun. There is something in that which I found, and still find, worthy of attention. Not many mortals have been willing to look directly at what I carry and make a direct claim on it. They pray. They offer. They invoked my name at dawn with grain and honey and turned palms. That is their usual register. Heracles simply raised his bow and waited. I brought the cup down. Not all the way to the shore, not with the horses still in harness and the afternoon arc unfinished. What I did was lower the angle of attention, the way one might lower the eyes to acknowledge someone who has earned acknowledgment. I let him understand that he had been seen, and that the cup would be available when I descended. The sun does not negotiate. But it can recognize a particular kind of courage, When I reached the western shore that evening and the horses moved toward the water, I set the cup at the margin. The great golden bowl that holds everything during the dark crossing, wide enough for the chariot and the 4 horses, the vessel that rides the night current of the Oceanus back to the east while I rest. Heracles was there before me. I do not know how he travelled from the south shore to the western landing so quickly. His labours involved many improbable journeys. He stood at the water's edge with his lion skin and his bow, and he looked at the cup with the same focused attention with which he had aimed his arrow. He climbed in. There is an image I return to sometimes, during the long arc on still mornings when memory moves freely. A mortal in my golden cup on the dark river Oceanus, surrounded by the silence of the night water. The stars above him and the river current below, crossing to the island of the red cattle that had been his next task. The cup that carries the sun's horses, bearing a man with a bow and a lion skin. Travelling the route that only the sun travels, I watched what I could from the eastern palace as the cup moved along the river. There is a limit to my sight in the darkness. I see by my own light, and without my light the world is what it is. But I knew the cup's course. I knew where it would reach shore in the morning. It brought him where he needed to go. He stepped out, I understood later, onto the island of Erythea, the red island at the edge of the world, where the cattle of Geryon grazed in the western light. His labour continued from there without my involvement. What Heracles did on that island is his story, not mine. What belongs to my account is only the confrontation on the shore and what I felt during it. He had made a demand of me that no other mortal had made so directly, without mediation, without ceremony, without anything except a drawn bow aimed at the sky. And the demand was not unreasonable. He needed what I had. He knew I had it. He asked in the only way available to him. There is a category of interaction that I find myself noting across the long crossings. Mortals who look at the sky with genuine attention and find something accurate in what they see. Sailors on Rhodes who read my rising as weather. Craftsmen who built a bronze form corresponding to what they understood of me. Heracles on a shore, calculating the geometry of the arc. I granted the cup out of something I have tried to name correctly ever since. Not fear of his arrow, not obligation, not precedent, not the kind of gift that creates debt. Call it the acknowledgement that passes between two things that have looked at each other clearly and found the other to be precisely what it appeared to be. He was exactly as large as he looked. And the cup, when it returned to me at dawn, was exactly as it had been left. The beaten gold undamaged, the proportions unchanged, the vessel ready for the next night crossing as it is always ready. Tide after tide on the dark river, bearing what needs to be borne through the hours when the world holds no light. Memory moves in unexpected directions sometimes. From the Heracles fragment, my thoughts do not travel forward. They travel sideways, the way the chariot drifts when Phlegon leans south, and I must correct without pulling hard, sideways and slightly down to an island in the western sea, to an expanse of pale grass catching the afternoon light, to two figures standing at the edge of a herd of cattle so white they seem lit from within. Thrinacia. The name arrives in me with a particular texture, not the sharp grief of the Eridanus, not the complicated residue of the net. Something else. A slow ache, the kind that does not announce itself loudly, but sits at the back of every quiet moment. I had daughters there, Phaethusa and Lampetie. The names come easily, as they always have. They were daughters of the Oceanid Neaera, born in the ordinary way of divine parentage, with that faint solar quality that marks my children. Not the blazing excess that undid Phaethon. Something quieter. A warmth that made the cattle at ease in their presence, that settled the herds without effort or command. Phaethusa was the older one. She had her mother's stillness, and something of my patience in the long crossing. She walked among the cattle without hurrying, touching a flank here, adjusting the direction of a drift there, keeping the herd from wandering to the water's edge when the western light made the sea look silver and inviting. She understood her work without it needing to be explained. Lampetti was the one who watched the sky. I noticed this early, as I notice everything from above. When I crossed over Thrinacia, she would look up, not the reflexive squint that mortals turn toward me before looking away. An actual, sustained attention. She tracked my movement the way my sailors on Rhodes read the rising, with a kind of working knowledge behind the gaze. She knew when I was late. She knew when the arc bent slightly south in the winter months, when the light arrived at a different angle and made the cattle's white flanks glow gold instead of bright silver. She registered these variations. That mattered to me more than I would have known how to explain. The cattle themselves. There were 50 herds of them, and 50 flocks of sheep to match. Each animal perfect, each one unmarked by ordinary aging, untouched by the illnesses that move through mortal livestock. They grazed on Thrinacia without diminishing the grass, as if the island sustained itself specifically to hold them. White coats, steady eyes, no more restless than the waves on a calm morning. They were mine in a specific sense, not merely property or symbol. They were part of what I am, in the way that the chariot is part of what I am, in the way that the arc of the sky belongs to the day. To lose one was to lose a small portion of the light that holds the world in order. I understood this as something practical, not as sentiment. I do not spend much time in sentiment. The crossing is too long and the work too constant for sustained feeling to gather undisturbed. But sentiment and grief are not the same thing, and what I carried regarding Thrinacia was closer to grief's quiet cousin. The knowledge that something irreplaceable was being tended in a place I could not protect from everything. I watched them, Phaethon and Lampetti, through many crossings. I watched the seasons change around them. The island green in the wet months, pale and dry when summer pressed down. I watched them grow more practiced in their tending, more certain in their movements. The cattle knew them completely. A herd animal reads a person's calm, and those animals had been reading calm from my daughters for so long that they moved around Phaethon and Lampetti like water round familiar stones. From above, the island was a white and green place, small in the scale of the sea around it, but distinct. I could pick it out without effort, even at the height of noon, when everything below contracts to geometry and colour. It had a particular quality of stillness. Thrinacia did not seem like a place where things went wrong. Memory requires care at this point. The chapter of Thrinacia does not close easily. I can hold the early images, the daughters at their work, the white herds. The particular quality of Lampettie's upward gaze, without the rest of it pressing in too hard, but the rest comes anyway. I was at height when the ships came. Midday, the arc at its peak, the chariot at the place where the sky seems most vast and the world below most remote. I had seen ships stop at Thrinacia before. It was a natural shelter. Sailors knew to avoid the cattle, as the reputation of the island had spread along the trade routes. These sailors knew. Their captain had told them. Odysseus had told them clearly. I understood afterward, had made his warnings in explicit terms. He had received his own instruction about what those herds represented. He was not uninformed. What I watched from height was not ignorance. It was the particular human failure that comes from time, from hunger, from desperation eroding the architecture of a decision that had been clear when first made. They had been on the island too long. The winds refused them departure. The provisions ran out, and Lampetti saw what was coming before it happened. She came to me in the way that my daughters could, not through the air, not by climbing. Through the particular channel that belongs to the children of the sun, a quality of direct address that bypasses ordinary petition and arrives with full clarity. She told me what was happening. What was about to happen? Her voice, when I recall it now, during still mornings when memory drifts freely, had a quality that I find difficult to name precisely. Not panic, not hysteria. A kind of exact grief. the way a good witness reports what they have seen, with all the emotion fully present, but none of it obscuring the facts. She was grieving, and she was accurate at the same time. I heard her from above the island. The chariot had its afternoon descent, the western shore already visible at the far edge of sight. Phaethon stood at the edge of the herd. The white cattle moved around her with their usual calm, not yet understanding what the day was moving toward. And I was at height. The sun does not descend from its course for a herd of cattle. That is not how things hold together. The arc completes itself. The chariot reaches the western shore in the time it was made to reach it. My daughter's grief does not alter the geometry of the sky. But I heard her. Lamberti's voice, carrying the exact shape of what she had seen, reached me clearly at altitude, over the sound of the horses and the wind of the upper air. I heard it. And I continued my descent toward the west. The western shore received me as it always did. The horses descended the final arc without difficulty. Phaethon, who had drifted slightly south in the afternoon warmth, steadied himself at the approach to the water. I let them slow at their own pace. The crossing was complete, but Lamberti's voice stayed with me as I entered the cup for the night crossing. It had that quality of grief I described. And I had heard it from altitude, and continued anyway, because the sky required my continuation. And the sky does not renegotiate its requirements for grief. I carried that through the night. The morning came. I rose from the east as mornings demand. The horses found their rhythm quickly, Pyrois and Phaethon taking the lead angle without correction. The chariot climbed through the early hours, and I did not need to look toward Thrinacia to know what I would find there. I looked anyway. The herd was smaller. From the height of morning. The precise count was not possible. I am not counting individual cattle when the arc is at its ascent and the horses are moving at full pace, but there is a quality to a herd on open ground, a density, a certain distribution of white shapes across pale grass. That changes when the herd loses members. The distribution was wrong. I knew the shape of those herds across decades of crossings, the way they clustered near the northern edge in the heat of summer, the way they spread toward the shore when the rains came and the grass grew thick. That morning they were clustered close together in a way that had nothing to do with season or weather. They were gathered the way animals gather when something has been taken from their number. Phaethon was standing among them with both hands at her sides. She did not look up. That was the detail that settled into me as the chariot climbed toward noon. She always looked up. Her sister tracked the arc with attention and interest, but Phaethon too had her way of acknowledging the crossing. A slight turn of the head, a stillness that was different from her ordinary stillness, a greeting after its own kind. She did not look up that morning. The cattle moved around her without their usual ease. They were not calm. The calm I had watched my daughters cultivate in those animals over years, through consistent and patient tending, had been interrupted in a single night by what the sailors had done. The men were still on the island. I could see their camp near the southern shore, the remains of their fire, the shape of figures moving through the day with the deliberate slowness of people who have committed an action they cannot uncircumstance. They knew what they had done. Odysseus among them would have known most of all, but knowing does not undo. I reached the height of noon with Thrinacia directly below. The island spread out clearly in the full light of midday. I could see everything. The scattered remnants near the cooking fire that told me how many had been taken. I did not want a precise count. The number was not the point. The point was what each animal meant in the structure of what I am, and even one was too many. Lampetti came to me again. The channel opened during the descent, that same direct clarity. Her voice without panic, reporting what had happened with the same careful accuracy as the day before. She told me the number. She told me which of the herds they had taken from. She told me that Odysseus had not participated, had eaten nothing, that his refusal had not prevented what his men decided. She told me that Phaethon had not slept, That detail arrived with particular weight. My older daughter, her mother Neaera's stillness in her hands and in her walking, had stood through the night at the edge of the remaining herd, not weeping, watching, as if her presence could establish a boundary around what remained. There is a kind of faithfulness that cannot protect what it loves. Phaethusa knew this. She stood there anyway. The chariot descended the western half of its arc, and I took what I had heard and turned it into something that could move through the channels to Olympus. It took shape in me the way conviction takes shape, not quickly, not with heat, but with accumulation. By the time the western shore came into view, it was complete. I spoke to Zeus. Not as petition, not as complaint. The Styx binds oaths made at the river, but there are obligations that exist without oaths, structures that underlie the whole arrangement of the world. I am the one who lights the world. Every field that grows, every sea path that is navigable, every mortal who rises from sleep and goes about the work of living, all of it requires my crossing. I told Zeus what had been taken from me. And then I said what I meant, if this was the manner of things now. If the cattle of the sun could be slaughtered without consequence, if my daughters could stand witness to destruction with no answer coming, then I would descend into the depths. I would cross to where Hades tends his kingdom and carry my light among the dead. Let the world manage its days without me. I do not say this to you lightly. I am telling you what I said, and I said it plainly, without decoration. It was not a threat constructed for effect. It was a statement of a possible choice. A God who sees everything also knows that seeing without consequence becomes a different kind of blindness. Zeus was quiet for a moment. Then he promised me justice. The word justice, when Zeus uses it, does not always mean comfort. It does not mean restoration. Hades does not return what he takes, and Zeus does not rebuild what has been destroyed. Justice meant that the account would be settled, that those who had taken would be answered. I continued my crossing. The following morning I rose in the east and aimed the chariot toward the ordinary arc of the day. The horses were well rested. Phlegon found his line immediately and held it. The world below came clear in the early light. Thrinacia was quiet. I found the ship with my eyes as I climbed toward noon. It had left the shelter of the island and was on open water, moving west. From altitude, a ship at sea is a small thing, a fragment of wood on a wide surface. I watched it for a long time. Zeus found it in the early afternoon. The lightning came from the direction of cloud cover that had been building since morning, the kind of weather that closes in quickly on the open sea. I watched the bolt strike. I watched the ship come apart in the way that struck ships come apart, quickly, and then the pieces spreading outward on the water, and then the water closing over most of what had been there. One figure remained on the surface longer than the others, Odysseus. I recognized him from above in the same way I had been recognizing him for days. He held to something, a piece of wreckage. He was carried by the current west and then back east. He would survive this day. He would not keep surviving because of any intervention from me. The justice was for the cattle, for my daughters standing through the night at the edge of a diminished herd, for Lampeter's voice arriving with its exact and measured grief, reporting facts in the careful way of a person who loves precision because the truth is the only instrument she has. The arc completed itself as the arc completes itself. Below, on Thrinacia, the remaining cattle grazed in the afternoon light. Phaethusa moved among them. She had the particular quality of motion that comes after a sleepless night, deliberate, placing each step with care. The herd moved around her. The island was still small and white and green against the sea. The ship was gone. The western shore received the chariot as it receives it each evening, without ceremony. The horses slowed on their own as the final light thinned across the water, and the great arc settled toward its end in the way that a long exhaled breath settles. I stepped down. The cup was waiting, as it is always waiting dark and wide against the current of Oceanus. I have stepped into it more times than any reckoning could hold. The number is not a number anymore. It is simply the shape of what I do. The horses went to their rest. Pyrois first, then Phaethon. Phlegon last, still warm from the long crossing, the heat of the day still in his coat. I watched them go. Then I boarded the cup, and the current took me, and the darkness of the underside of the world closed over everything. There is no seeing in the night crossing. This is worth saying, because it is the one condition of my existence that most mortals do not consider. I am Panoptes. I am the one who sees. From altitude, the whole surface of the world is available to me. Its roads and rivers, its fields and its fires. The small figures moving through the day's business below, going about what they go about, unaware that their movement is visible from above as a pattern. But in the cup, beneath Oceanus, there is nothing. The current moves. The water of the world ocean passes above me, lit from the surface by Selene's passage, and I am below even that. What reaches me down here is not light. It is the sound of water moving over stone, somewhere far above, the slow drag of current against the cup's wide hull, and my own thoughts. I had not realized in the days preceding how much of my attention the events on Thrinacia had taken. The watching. The precise cataloguing of what I saw from altitude. The ship anchored in the southern cove. The cooking fire. The morning I noticed it was smaller. The morning I noticed what the smoke carried. Lamberti's voice arriving before the chariot had reached midpoint in the arc. Phaethon standing at the edge of the herd in a posture that no amount of altitude could conceal, now with nothing to see. Those images arranged themselves differently, not as events I was still processing, not as things requiring action. The account had been settled. Zeus had spoken in the way Zeus speaks, through weather gathered quickly over open water. The ship was gone. The mortal responsible, or the one who had lived longest in my field of vision, was somewhere on the sea carried by a current not of his choosing. What remained was simply the memory of it. I let the cup move, and I thought about Phaethon. Not what she had done in the crisis, which I had already turned over many times, but the way she moved, in ordinary days. The manner she has of settling into stillness that her mother Neaera also had, a physical quality, like water that has stopped running and finds its own level. When the herd was whole and undisturbed, Phaethon would stand at the edge of the morning grass, not watching for anything, just present, the white cattle grazing around her feet. Thrinacia, quiet in every direction. I have watched her this way hundreds of times from the chariot arc. Perhaps thousands. The number, again, is not a number. What I was thinking, in the dark beneath Oceanus, was this. That faithfulness of the kind Phaethon has, the kind that does not announce itself, that simply continues to stand at the boundary of what it loves, is one of the older structures. It predates the Olympian arrangement. It predates the Titanomachy and the Long War and the drawing of lots that sorted the world into domains. Faithfulness of that particular kind existed before any of the conflict did. My father Hyperion understood this. He had it too. The thought of Hyperion arrived without weight, which it did not always do. There were years, long years, in the early period after the war, when the thought of my father carried the particular heaviness of things that cannot be resolved. He was taken. Cast into Tartarus with the others, I continued to rise each morning in his place, doing what he had done. Carrying the fire he had carried. For a long time that felt like an account with no settlement. Now it was simply what had happened. The cosmos had taken the shape it took. The Olympian order was the order. Zeus promised justice, and sometimes delivered it. The cup moved beneath the world each night, and the chariot rose again each morning. This was the structure. I did not arrive at acceptance of it through argument. I arrived at it through repetition, through the simple accumulation of mornings. The current shifted slightly. I felt it in the cup's movement. I was somewhere below the middle of the ocean. The eastern shore was still many hours away. Selene was moving overhead, carrying her own light across the surface of the world I could not see, tending the dark hours in the way she has always tended them. Her light reaching down through the deep water in pale columns that did not quite reach me. In the morning, Eos would open the gates before I arrived. This was the oldest arrangement, the three of us moving in sequence, handing the sky from one to the next. Eos beginning the light before I could provide it. Me carrying it to the point where Selene could continue. Selene sustaining what remained until Eos returned. It required no coordination, no discussion. It had been the same so long that the sequence had become its own form of knowledge, written not in memory but in the body's habit. I thought about the Heliades for a moment, not with the grief that had once accompanied the thought of them. The poplar trees on the Eridanus, weeping amber into the river's current. Phaethon, somewhere in that river's bed. The day I had not risen, and the world had sat in unlit stillness, and the gods had come to me with careful voices, asking me to return to the chariot. I had returned. Because the structure required it, because chaos, when it comes, does not repair itself. Because the darkness that felt like the right answer in the immediate aftermath of catastrophe becomes simply more damage after a certain point. The arc of the sky was mine. That was the arrangement, and arrangements, even the painful ones, hold the world in its shape. The cup moved on. The water was cold at this depth. The sound of Oceanus was a low, constant note, unhurried, neither urgent nor diminishing. A god who sees everything rests, finally, in the dark. Not because the darkness is comfortable, but because the eyes need somewhere to put down what they have been carrying. The ship was gone. The remaining cattle grazed on Thrinacia under Selene's light. Phaethon was probably sleeping now. Finally, her mother's quality of stillness released at last into actual rest. The eastern shore was still hours away. I let the current carry me, and I closed my eyes, which changes nothing when there is nothing to see, but is a gesture the body makes toward its own rest. The cup moved east beneath the world. Above it, the ocean. Above the ocean, the dark sky and Selene's careful passage. Above the sky, whatever is above the sky, the cup settled into a steadier current. The coldness of the water around it became, after a while, simply the condition of the place. I had been thinking about Demeter. The memory arrived, the way many memories arrive in the crossing dark, not summoned, not predicted, simply present when I noticed it. It was old, older than the Thrinacia trouble, older than Heracles, standing on the shore with his bow drawn. The memory belonged to a different age of difficulty, and Demeter had come to me with a face I had not expected to see on a goddess of her standing. She had been searching for many days. I understood this from looking at her. A deity can carry time differently than a mortal can, but Demeter's grief had reached the particular density that accumulates when searching yields nothing. Her feet had covered the earth in every direction. She had asked at every threshold. She had carried torches through the night, which is the part the mortals remember, the image of her moving through darkness with fire in each hand, calling a name the dark did not return. I had seen all of it from the chariot arc. I had seen the moment it happened. That is the part she did not yet know. Hades had risen from a cleft in the earth in a place of flowers. The girl had been reaching for a narcissus. I had watched the ground open, watched the chariot emerge, watched Persephone carried down before she had fully understood what was happening. I had heard her call out. The sound travelled far in the open air, further than she might have expected, but there was no one positioned to hear it except Hecate, who was at some distance, and myself, who was everywhere above. I knew. I had carried the knowledge for days while Demeter searched below me, not with pleasure. Not with indifference either. I was not certain what had stayed my hand from going to her sooner. Perhaps the old reluctance to involve oneself in what Zeus had arranged. Perhaps the knowledge that what I had to tell her would not feel, initially, like a gift. She came to me on the road above Eleusis, not to the chariot. I was not in the chariot. She found me in the form I sometimes take when the arc is complete and the descent has been made and the horses are given over to rest. I was standing at the edge of the world's western margin where the light finishes. She said, "You see all things." It was not a question. I told her yes. She said, "Then tell me where my daughter is." There was a quality in her voice that I had not heard before from the Olympian generation. The Titans were capable of a grief that moved through everything around it, the way water moves through soil. Demeter had that quality in her voice now. She was asking as a mother, not as a goddess. The distinction was clear. I told her what I had seen. I told her plainly. Hades came from beneath the earth in a place of flowers. He took Persephone into the ground. The earth closed again. Zeus had arranged it. She stood without speaking for a moment. I watched her take in the shape of what I had said. Zeus had arranged it. That particular phrase was the one that altered her face. Not the taking itself. She had already feared the taking. It was the knowledge that the highest authority had ordered the taking, that the order of things had made room for this, that her searching had been, in some sense, walking through a world that had already been reorganized without her. I told her what I thought was true, that Hades held no small domain, that Persephone would be queen of what he ruled, that the honor given to her was real, even if the manner of the giving had not been. I do not know if this helped. I suspected, watching her, that it did not help immediately. Some truths need time to become anything other than damage. She thanked me, formally, the way goddesses thank those who have given them necessary things they did not want to receive. Then she went toward Olympus, and the world, which she had stopped tending while she searched, became visible from my chariot arc in the days that followed as something parched, with fields standing dry and grain failing in the furrow. The earth was expressing what Demeter felt. That was the nature of her power. It could not be entirely separated from her grief. I continued to rise each morning. I watched the fields below. I watched Demeter's withdrawal deepen into something the mortals felt in their bodies, in their empty granaries, in the animals thinning with the failing grass. The account that followed, the negotiation, the compromise, the division of the year into its two movements, that was not mine to resolve. I had given what I had to give. I had told her what I knew. The cup moved in the dark beneath Oceanus. That memory of Demeter standing at the western margin, her voice carrying the weight of many days of searching, settled into the other memories and was still. What I thought about then was the particular quality of being asked to speak. All seeing carries an assumption. The assumption is that what is seen is for sharing, that the one who stands at the vantage point of the sky owes the world below an accounting of what passes through the field of vision. Perhaps not entirely. I saw the affair of Ares and Aphrodite. I went to Hephaestus. I saw the cattle slaughtered on Thrinacia. I went to Zeus. I saw Persephone taken. I waited until I was asked. These three choices were not the same choice. The weights were different. The necessities were different. Being the witness who tells is not the same action every time it is performed. The current beneath me was slow. The cup was steady. In the memory of Demeter's face, receiving the news, I recognized the expression of someone who has arrived at the edge of the thing they feared and found it solid. The way a hand pressed flat against stone finds that the stone does not give. She had needed the truth more than she needed comfort. I had given her the truth. The comfort, if any came, would have to arrive later from other sources, in other forms. What I gave her had cost her peace and bought her direction. Direction, in a grief as large as hers, was the thing that mattered. A grief with nowhere to go is a different weight than a grief that knows which door to knock on. She had knocked on Olympus after she left me. I had watched her go. A figure moving across the surface of the earth. I illuminated, growing smaller in the distance, then out of range of the visible in the way that even gods could move out of range. The eastern shore was still hours away. The dark water moved around the cup without sound. The memory of Demeter faded slowly, the way memories fade in that crossing, not lost. Just returned to the general store of what has been carried long enough that it no longer requires attention to remain intact. She had found her daughter, eventually. The world had arranged itself into seasons because of what I told her, standing at the western margin where the light ends. Small testimony. Large consequence. The cup moved on. The dark water moved. The cup moved with it. I let the memory of Demeter settle, and then I waited for what came next in the way one waits for anything in the crossing, without hurrying it, without resisting it. What came was not a single memory, it was a quality, a texture that ran through many memories at once, the texture of being invoked. I know the sound of my name spoken in oath. It is different from my name spoken in prayer. Prayer asks for something. Oath-swearing calls me as a witness, the way one calls a neighbour to stand at the edge of a disputed field and see where the boundary marker stands. Mortals would clasp their hands together, turn their faces upward, and speak my name into the sky. Helios, who sees all things. Helios, before whom nothing is hidden. Let Helios be witness to this. The sky was what they were addressing. They believed the sky and I were the same thing in that moment. Perhaps that is not entirely wrong. Gods, when they swore by me, did it differently. The words were more precise. They knew what they were invoking, not just the light above, but the one who drove through it, who had seen the beginning of the Olympian age, who had watched the Titanomachy from the edge of the world and continued rising the following morning all the same. An oath sworn under my witness carries a particular weight. I thought about that weight floating in the dark. The Styx carries her own weight in oaths. Her water is the deepest binding, but I am the one who sees. The Styx can enforce, I can confirm. These are different functions, and both are needed. Circe understood this. Of all my children, she was the one who most clearly grasped the nature of what I had given her, not the fire itself, but the vision that fire enables. I had watched her on Aeaea. From above, the way I watched all things from above, her island was a point of green in the Aegean spread of blue. From my chariot height, the smoke from her fires rose in a thin column. The animals she kept moved in their strange ordered patterns around the house. She had taken what was solar in me and turned it inward. My light moves outward, always outward, across the sky, across the world's surface, touching everything at once. Circe's version of that same fire went inward, into the roots of plants, into the hidden properties of things, into the transformation that happens when one form of matter is persuaded to become another. I do not know if she was happy on Aeaea. Happiness is not the word I would reach for when I think of her. She was precise. She was complete. She had made her island into a place that operated according to her understanding, and her understanding was deep. She was mine. In the way that a flame thrown off from a larger fire is still fire, still made of the same substance, still carrying the same essential nature. Aeetes was different. Colchis, from above, was a different kind of green. Darker, denser, the trees pressing close to the river Phaethon where it met the sea. I watched Aeetes build his kingdom in that eastern land, watched the palace rise above the trees, watched the golden fleece hung in its sacred grove, with the sleepless serpent coiled beneath it. He had more of my visible aspect. The brightness, the insistence on being seen. He wore power differently than Circe, outward, declared a light that demanded acknowledgement. His daughter Medea had taken from him what Circe had taken from me. The inward version, the knowledge of roots and transformations. Solar fire moves through generations in this way. It does not diminish. It changes form. Pacify in Crete. I had watched her too from above, the white bull and the particular fate that Poseidon's anger had arranged. That was not a memory I held long. Some things seen from the chariot are simply part of the texture of a world that contains both grace and suffering in equal measure. I had not arranged Pasiphae's fate. I had only illuminated it as I illuminate everything. This is the distinction I return to in the crossing's dark. There is a difference between being the light and being responsible for everything the light falls on. The cup drifted. The current was steady beneath me. I thought about Rhodes. Not with effort. Rhodes arrives in memory easily, the way a pleasing thing arrives. The island sitting in the Aegean, like something placed deliberately, its hills sloping down to a sea that takes the blue of the sky because the sky has given it that colour. When the gods divided dominion among themselves, I was absent. I was where I always am during the day, crossing the sky in the chariot, doing what I do. There was no malice in my absence from that drawing of lots. There was only the fact that the sky required tending, and the sky had no one else. When I descended and found no portion had been saved for me, there was a moment of stillness, the kind of stillness that precedes understanding. Then I had looked down, the way I looked down at everything, and seen Rhodes rising from the water. New rock, new green, the sea white where it broke against the new shores, unclaimed, still arranging itself into the form it would hold for centuries. I had said, that island, if it belongs to no one, I will call mine, and it had been agreed. Rhodes became the place that knew my name most precisely. The Rhodians oriented their whole understanding of the day around what I did. Their festivals acknowledged the chariot. Their poetry rehearsed the names of the horses, Pyrrhoa, Eos, Phaethon, Phlegon, as though speaking them was a form of gratitude. I had valued that, in the way one values being correctly understood. The dark water did not carry the image of Rhodes for long. It offered the image and then drew back, the way water draws back from the edge of a shore. What remained was older than Rhodes, older than Colchis, older than Aea. The quality of oath, the quality of witness. Gods had stood beneath the open sky and spoken my name, and meant by it, the one who will remember, the one who sees with eyes that do not close, the one whose movement through the sky is itself a kind of testimony, daily, repeated, uninterrupted. Hyperion had seen this in me before I understood it in myself. He had said, in the Eastern Palace, when I was still new to the chariot and still learning the weight of what it meant to carry the day, you are not only the light, you are the evidence that the light was here. Evidence. The word had seemed odd to me then. Now, in the crossing, it seemed simply accurate. Every morning that I rose was a record of the morning before. Every arc completed confirmed the arc's completion. The sky held the trace of every passage I had made through it, not as visible marks, but as accumulated fact. The world knew the sun had risen because the sun rose again. The oath-takers knew their oaths had witnesses because I was the one who watched, day after day, with the same attention, the same reach of vision, the same willingness to remember what had been placed before my eyes. Circe weaving something on Aeaea, the smoke rising from her fires. Aeetes standing at the edge of the phases, watching the eastern light come down. My descendants carrying the solar fire forward in their own ways, in the directions their own natures had taken it. The cup moved on through the dark. Somewhere ahead, the eastern shore waited. The current knew the way. It had always known the way. The current did not change. That was the thing about this crossing. It held the same pace regardless of what memory arrived, the same steadiness beneath the cup, the same dark water offering nothing in the way of landmarks, and yet the memories themselves had their own motion. They arrived not in the order they had happened, but in the order they needed to be felt. That was the crossing's logic. Not chronology, something older than chronology. What came now was the ascent, not a single morning. Every morning. The accumulated fact of every dawn I had ever made, distilled into one image that the dark water carried up to me like an offering. Eos opening the sky before me, she was always first. That was her nature and her gift. The rosy light spreading along the horizon, the gates of dawn drawn back, the sky going from black to the particular dark blue that belongs only to that threshold moment. Her hands on the gates, her face turned briefly toward me before she moved on. She never lingered. Eos ran ahead, opening what needed to be opened, and left the sky ready. The Horai were next. The Hours, those careful keepers of order, who understood the chariot's needs better than I needed to ask. They moved around Pyrrha and Phaethon and Phlegon with steady attention, checking each harness point, each connection of leather and bronze. Eos, the horse, not my sister, though the name was hers as well. A double gift of naming stood still for their hands, her coat already throwing light in the eastern palace's glow. The Horai did not speak much. They communicated through arrangement, the position of a strap, the angle at which they brought the chariot forward. Their work was the language of precision, and I had learned over uncountable mornings to read it fluently. When they stood back, the chariot was ready. The aureole came last. I am not sure who first placed it on my head. There was a time before I wore it, and then a time when I did, and the transition is not something I can locate precisely. Hyperion had worn something similar. Perhaps it had passed to me from him. Perhaps it had grown from my own nature the way certain things grow, not given but gradually realized. The solar crown. The disk of radiance that declared what I was before the chariot even moved. Putting it on was not a ceremony. It was a recognition, the way a hand recognizes a familiar weight, and then the ascent. The horses knew the path. They had known it since before I had known it myself. Pyrrhus, the fiery one, always pulled slightly ahead at the start, impatient with the moment of stillness before motion. Phlegon matched him. Phaethon and Eos held the centre line steady. The four of them found their accord in the first seconds of movement, and after that the chariot rose without effort. The eastern palace fell away below. Oceanus spread out in every direction. The dark water of the world's edge catching the first light I was bringing with me, throwing it back in long broken lines across the surface. Then the land appeared. The edge of it first, the coastlines where the world began. Rising meant seeing more of it. Each moment of ascent added a new horizon. Another set of hills, another river cutting through dark land toward the sea. Another city still sleeping, its rooftops visible, its streets empty in that particular quiet that belongs only to the hour before the day commits to being what it will be. I rose through that quiet. The world turned toward me as I came. Not all at once. It turned by degrees, the way attention shifts when something enters a room. First the mountain tops caught the light, then the upper hillsides, then the valleys, then the low ground by the rivers. Then the water itself, the lakes and slow rivers brightening from black to grey to the particular colour of early morning that has no name. I know but that I have seen an uncountable number of times, and would recognize if I were blind. I was not blind. I saw everything. From the highest point of the ark, standing in the chariot with Pyrrhus and Phlegon pulling west, and Phaethon and Eos moving with them in perfect accord, I could see the shape of the world entire. The curves of the land masses, the dark lines of mountain ranges from above, the silver threading of rivers through plains, the cattle on Thrinacia, white against green, grazing without concern, the smoke from Aea rising in a slow column from Circe's fires, Colchis. At the far eastern edge of the sea, the palace roof visible among the trees, Rhodes always recognizable. Its particular colour, the way it sat in the water, as though the water had arranged itself deliberately around it. Every day I crossed all of it. Every day the chariot traced the same arc and showed me everything beneath it. Everything that lived within the light I was carrying from one horizon to the other. This was not a burden. I had held it incorrectly once, early, before I understood what it was. I had thought of it as the weight of responsibility, the world needing me, depending on my crossing, unable to function without what I carried. That framing made it heavy in the wrong way. What the ascent actually was, understood from inside it, was this: participation, not responsibility, not obligation. The simple fact of being the thing that makes the day. The horses understood it that way. They did not strain under the weight of the ark. They moved into it the way anything moves into its truest function, not with effort, but with the ease of doing what one was made to do. I had learned that ease from them in the early crossings, from watching how Pyrrha took the height without hesitation, from how Phaethon steadied when the route began its descent, from how Phaethon and Eos, the quiet ones, the even ones, held the chariot's motion constant through the middle hours when the temptation was to hurry or to linger. No hurrying, no lingering. The ark had a shape, and the shape was correct, and the only thing required was to hold to it. The cup moved on the dark water. I lay in it and let the ascent memory settle back into the place where memories rested. What remained afterward was not an image. It was a quality. The quality of having risen, of having crossed, of having carried the light across the whole face of the world and delivered it to the western ocean at the day's end, having given what I was made to give, not once but every day. The accumulation of all those days becoming the simplest possible answer to the question of what I was. Hyperion had seen this in me. Thea had seen it too, though she had expressed it differently. In the Eastern Palace, watching me harness the horses in those first mornings, she had said nothing, only watched, and in her watching a confirmation. The current carried me. The dark water held the cup lightly, the way cupped hands hold water, not gripping, only offering a shape. The eastern shore remained ahead, unseen. It had always been ahead. It would arrive when it arrived, and not before, and there was no shortening the distance by thinking about it. So I thought instead about Eos running before me on the next morning, her rosy light doing what it had always done, the gates of dawn opening the way they had always opened. The Horai and their careful hands on the harnesses. Pyrrha impatient. Phaethon steady. Phaethon quiet. Eos the horse, turning her head once before the ascent began, as though checking that I was ready. I was always ready. The cup drifted, somewhere in the dark. Amber was still caught in poplar bark along the Eridanus, the grief of the Helios hardened into light, a kind of testimony in its own right, carrying something of me forward in a form no one had planned, but that the world had made room for none the less. The amber along the Eridanus. I stayed with that thought for a while. Not the grief of it. I had moved past the grief, or the grief had moved through me and left something else behind, something quieter and harder to name. What I stayed with was the image itself, the bark, the slow seep of resin, the way the trees stood in rows along the bank, still and permanent, doing the only thing they could still do with everything they had once been. My daughters. The Heliades had stood on that river bank as my daughters first, before the transformation took them. They had stood there with their mother Clymene, watching the place in the water where Phaethon had gone down, and they had wept without stopping, wept past the point where weeping could still accomplish anything. Wept past the point where their bodies remained capable of being bodies, until the world found another form for them. The amber was their tears. Hawked, held, made permanent in a way that grief rarely is. I thought about them often, in the cup, not with the sharp pull of loss that had attended the thought of Phaethon himself, but with something softer, a recognition that they had loved their brother with a completeness that did not leave room for their own preservation. That kind of love was its own form of radiance, even in its ending. The cup turned slightly in the current, a slow rotation, barely perceptible, the way a leaf turns in still water when something passes beneath it. I thought then of Selene, not of the Heliades. not of Phaethon, not of any of the things that belong to loss. I thought of my sister, the moon, and the way the world looked from her position, that long silver view of the night. The same world I saw by day, but returned to darkness, its shapes visible only by the light she carried. We were mirrors of each other in that way. She saw what I had just crossed. I would cross what she had just seen. The same mountains, the same rivers, the same sleeping cities, moving through each other's gaze in the endless alternation that neither of us had designed and neither of us directed. It was simply what the arrangement was. Hyperion had shaped two paths before we were born. Or the paths had always existed, and Hyperion's children were simply the ones who walked them. I could never determine which was true, and in the cup, in the dark, it did not seem to matter. What mattered was Selene herself, the quality of her particular light. The way she moved through her arc with a patience that made even my steadiest crossing seem briefly urgent by comparison. She had none of Pyrrhos's impatience in her. She moved with the even, unhurried certainty of Phaethon and the horse Eos combined, and she did it across a sky empty of everything except her own radiance and the stars behind it. We had spoken, my sister and I, at the horizon, not often. The horizon was not a place where conversations could sustain themselves. It was a threshold, a brief adjacency between my departure and her arrival, and there was rarely time for more than a glance across the darkening edge of the sky. But those glances carried weight. There was a look she gave me sometimes when I was descending and she was preparing to rise. A particular attention in it, a noticing, the way she watched the last light go. I did not know what she was watching for precisely, whether she was watching for signs of the day's toll in how I carried myself, or whether she was simply doing what I also did, marking the handoff, acknowledging that one of us was about to continue what the other was putting down. We had never needed many words. Eos was different. Eos spoke through movement. Through the colour she put into the sky ahead of me, rose and gold, and the particular pale brightness at the horizon's edge that was neither one thing nor the other. She was always ahead of me, always running into the dark to open it before I arrived, never looking back. She never looked back, but I knew she was aware of me. That was the nature of what we were to each other. She made space. I filled it. The sky went from her colours to my light in the way a sentence moves from its opening word to its completion, not a transition exactly, but a continuation of the same motion in a different register. I had followed her light every morning for longer than I could count. She had preceded me for just as long. Through just as many skies, over just as many sleeping cities and dark meadows and rivers, catching the first suggestion of the day. We had never discussed this. There was nothing to discuss. It was what we were. The three of us, Eos, myself, Selene, had arrived in the world as three parts of a single process. The day was not any one of us. The day was all three, in sequence, each movement following the previous with a precision that needed no coordination because it was not coordination. It was nature. The way water flows downhill is not a coordination between the water and the hill. We were the passage of light across the world. Each of us held one portion of it, the opening, the full crossing, the long soft closure at the end. The cup moved on. I let the memory of Selene's face at the western horizon drift through my mind without holding it too tightly. The expression she wore when she was about to take the sky, not eagerness, not gravity, something composed, something that had already accepted what the night would require of her and had made peace with it before beginning. She had always been more at peace with her portion than I was with mine. Or perhaps it was simply that the night asked less visible work. The moon did not need to light the fields for growing. The moon did not need to warm the stone, ripen the grain, burn away the morning's cold. The moon moved through its portion, and the world slept beneath it, and the sleeping was enough. My light required response. Hers invited rest. I thought sometimes that what Selene carried in her arc was the quieter version of what I carried in mine, the same motion, the same family. The same ancient inheritance from Hyperion and Thea, but transposed into a key that asked nothing strenuous of the world it crossed. Perhaps that was why she seemed so calm at the horizon. She was not preparing for effort, she was preparing for the long, slow work of simply being present while the world lay still. I had respected that in her without knowing how to say so. The dark water carried me. The cup had no particular relation to time. Events arrived when they arrived. Selene at the horizon, her silver look. Eos ahead of me, rosy, moving fast, not looking back but always there. The Horai adjusting the harnesses in the morning silence. The horses ready. The three of us, born from the same light, moving through our portions of the same great circle. Each one brief at the boundary where the others began. That boundary. That was where I had understood what family was, more clearly than anywhere else. Not in the Eastern Palace, not in the preparations, not in anything that could be spoken. At the place where her light ended and mine began. Each morning I crossed through something my sister had made. She had run ahead into the dark and returned it to something approaching colour, and I had stepped into that colour and continued what she had started. Her rosy light was still in the sky when I rose. For those few minutes we were both present. Then she was gone, moving toward wherever Eos went when the day began. And I was alone with the chariot and the horses and the long arc before me. But the colour she had left was still there. I drove through it every morning, for all those mornings, and never stopped noticing it. The cup moved on through the dark water, and I let the memory settle like sediment returning to a riverbed after a current has passed through. There was a particular quality to the silence out here on the Oceanus, where the water was black and the stars sat close to the surface as though considering their own reflections. I had crossed this water more times than any reckoning could hold. I knew the places where small currents turned the cup slightly, where the water deepened in colour from black to something without a name, where the far banks of the world gave off a faint pale luminescence that was neither starlight nor any other light I recognized. I knew this passage the way I knew the interior of my own hands. And still, tonight something in the crossing felt different in its texture, not heavier, not lighter, simply more present to me than usual, as though the cup rode slower, or as though I had grown more attentive in my stillness. Rhodes would be catching the last warmth of me now. The southern Aegean held heat longer than other waters, and the stone of that island, pale limestone terraced down toward the sea, stored what the sun gave it through the day and released it slowly into the night. I thought of it glowing faintly out there in the dark, breathing warmth into the air around it, the harbours, the hillsides carved into cultivation, the people who built their temples facing east, orienting their sacred spaces toward the direction I came from. That island had been given to no one, and so I had claimed it with my own light, and the claim had held. There was something right about a place that carried the warmth of sunlight into its very stone, something that pleased me in the thought of it, even here in the dark. A new lamp had been placed along the western promontory sometime in the last year. I had noticed it on clear mornings, its bronze stand catching the first horizontal light before the sun crested the hills above. Some family had put it there, for what purpose I could not say exactly. An offering, perhaps, or simply a habit that had become devotion. I thought of that lamp now. The small bronze stand, the particular angle at which it caught the earliest ray of the day and threw a brief flash of reflected light out to sea. Such small things. I had witnessed everything the world had ever done. The Titanomachy, when the old order broke apart and I drove on through it because there was no other choice. The moment Phaethon took the reins, and the horses felt the difference immediately, and I stood helpless at the western gate watching the earth burn below. The Eridanus, where the poplars stood in a row now with my daughters locked inside them. Their amber tears still caught in the bark, a grief so complete and so particular that the gods had made it permanent rather than let it dissolve. That amber, it was still there. It would continue to be there long after other griefs had resolved themselves. On Thrinacia, where the white cattle no longer grazed, the daughters Phaethusa and Lampetai had tended those herds with such care, counting each animal at evening, keeping their coats clean, knowing each one by the sound of its movement through the grass. That island was quiet now, different in character. Still beautiful, Lampetti had told me once, in the way she spoke when she was finding what was good in a difficult thing. The cattle were gone, but the island remained. It had not been their fault. None of it had been theirs. They had watched it coming, the way my daughters always watch things coming, from a fixed position, with clear eyes. Unable to stop what the fates had already woven into the pattern, I had not forgotten what I told Zeus afterward, that the light I carried could go elsewhere, that there were other places for it. The anger of that moment had been real as anything I had ever felt from the height of the chariot. Zeus had done what he said he would. He had kept the promise. The ship had gone down. Justice had happened, and the grief had not resolved, and both of these things were simply true simultaneously. Circe was awake tonight. She was always awake when the night was deep and clear like this one. On Aea, where the mist came in from the sea and the fires burned inside, she would be working at something. Her hands at a loom, perhaps, or bent over something that required concentration. She carried the solar fire in a different form. Inward, concentrated. Heat made into transformation rather than light made into warmth. She had taken what I gave and folded it into a different shape entirely. I had watched her for a long time from above. I had never stopped marveling at what she became. Aeetes was different. Aeetes had taken the fire outward, into authority, into the guarding of things. The golden fleece hanging in the grove, the sleepless serpent coiled below it. My son understood that some things must be held. I had given both of them the same beginning. They had moved in entirely different directions. That was the nature of inheritance. The cup turned slightly in a current I recognized. I had reached the midpoint of the crossing, the deepest place, where the Oceanus ran broadest and the far shore was not yet visible. I would rest here a little longer before the eastern horizon began to show its earliest suggestion of light. Not yet. For a little while longer, only the dark water, and the quiet, and the stars sitting close to the surface. Demeter had stood before me once and asked me to tell her what I had seen. I had told her. I told her because the truth belonged to her, and because I had been carrying it, and because there is no point in seeing everything if the seeing never speaks. Seasons had come from that conversation. I had not known that was what I was making when I spoke. I never knew what the light would make of itself when it fell on things. That was the one thing I could not see from the chariot's height. The result, I could see the falling of the light. I could see the surfaces it touched. What grew from the touching, what changed in the ground where it reached, that was made in a register beyond even my sight. The amber in the poplar bark along the Eridanus, the warmth still moving through the limestone of Rhodes, the pale lampstand on the western promontory catching the first flash of the morning. The cup moved on toward the east, and the dark water carried me forward as it had always done, and the horses waited in their stable for the morning, and the Horai would come before dawn to prepare them, and Eos was already somewhere ahead, moving into the dark to open it, rose and gold. Not looking back, I would follow her light into the sky again, as I had done without fail through all the ages of the world. And if you have found rest tonight in this long crossing, in the dark water and the amber and the quiet turning of the cup, then perhaps you will return to Olympus Dreams and carry one more night's journey with you. A quiet subscription, a promise to come back when the next story calls from the edge of the ancient world. The eastern horizon showed the first suggestion, faint as breath on cold air, that the dark was preparing to become something else.